Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, we will be using interviews, quotes, statements, and more from 𝗷𝗵𝗲 and others at Nintendo to discuss the overworld of Breath of the Wild 2, some interesting details about the Zonai and how they may appear in the game, other new abilities Link may have, and how we believe the themed temples will be in the game, and much more. Let's begin with how different Hyrule will be and how some new areas or dungeons could be discovered. The first thing we see from the overworld of Breath of the Wild 2 is a major earthquake happening and the castle lifting off or being pushed off the ground. We know this isn't really a typical earthquake, but one caused by Ganon's malice. It also feels like this will have much more of an impact on Hyrule than some might think, as it takes up a significant portion of the end of the trailer. The rest of the trailer seems to just be a big build-up leading to this earthquake happening and showing the effects of this playing out from Link and Zelda's perspective. The second trailer begins with what looks like a continuation of these same events. The end of the second trailer also strongly focuses on Hyrule shaking and the castle lifting, but from new perspectives. If it is strong enough to affect more than Central Hyrule, it could be the cause or reason that Nintendo uses to change the landscape. So it feels like Nintendo was potentially emphasizing just how important this earthquake may be. Yes, we will be exploring caves underground, locations and islands floating in the sky, but also hopefully more of the overworld itself, which likely won't be completely similar or identical compared to Breath of the Wild 1. Instead, it's possible some areas could end up being completely unrecognizable. Inside the cave, we could see the ground completely breaking apart, creating cliffs, and drop off so deep we can't even see the bottom. Above the ground, we are led to believe all of Hyrule is being violently shaken, which could cause significant changes to bodies of water, towns, villages, and bridges. We could also see many fissures open up, revealing hidden caves, dungeons, or even temples. First, we have some interviews, quotes, and statements from Nintendo that could help support this idea. 𝗷𝗵𝗲 and others at Nintendo have stated in various interviews that they purposefully change where certain locations are placed, the size of the location, the landmarks found within, and more for each game. The reason for this is because if Kakariko Village or Lake Hylia are located in the same area or looks exactly the same, then it would become boring. So to keep it fun and interesting, they will change almost anything and everything about the locations to make them as fun and entertaining as possible. However, they do also like to keep a few familiar landmarks and other things in these locations so that it still feels like the other versions, while still being brand new and providing new experiences. With this in mind, as well as other interviews from before Breath of the Wild released, and we had no confirmation on DLC, 𝗷𝗵𝗲 was asked with the rise in popularity of DLC and expansions if he would consider releasing DLC for Breath of the Wild. He stated he loved this version of Hyrule so much that he and his team are constantly coming up with new ideas or concepts to incorporate into the overworld to make it even better. They had so much fun doing this. They would also have to actively remind themselves to stop. The game has a deadline and a release date, and if they continued changing and adding things to the overworld, they would get carried away and miss these deadlines. In another interview, they mentioned how they wanted Breath of the Wild to have a dynamic overworld that would evolve and change based on the player's actions, which sadly didn't end up happening with the exception of Tarrey Town. Nintendo has also stated the purpose for the Hero's Path DLC was for the developers to document which areas were popular and frequently visited and which were less popular, as well as the amount of time spent at different locations. They would look at the places that were less popular and add new activities, quests, or other things to make these spots more fun. They would also look into whether or not less popular areas were rarely visited because it was too hard to reach or just had nothing interesting around it to lead you to it. We did get a taste of these new additions in the DLC, with masks, journals, armor, weapons, quests, and other new DLC content being specifically placed in or around these less popular areas to bring more attention to them by motivating the player with an actual reason and purpose for visiting and discovering the areas. With all of this in mind, it seems likely Nintendo will continue with their original plans and Hyrule will change more than some may expect. We know certain locations in the overworld don't appear in the trailer. Some fans believe the Great Deku Tree and the land around him to be completely missing. The popular theory is, similar to Hyrule Castle, it is simply one of the many various areas that will be raised into the sky. If this is the case, Hyrule could change in many ways that may not be noticeable at first. We may not just have familiar locations now floating in the sky and leaving behind large holes in the ground, but just as we saw with Hyrule Castle rising up, and as mentioned before, it seems to cause these massive earthquakes. Just like in real life, these earthquakes could cause certain rivers to split or flow in new directions, causing new lakes in areas that weren't even close to bodies of water before. The holes left behind from the castle and other areas, as well as cracks, crevices, and fissures in the ground, all of which could lead to new areas such as the underground caves we see in the trailer. This potentially could even cause minor avalanches in places like the snowy mountains of the 𝗏𝗏 region, opening up previously hidden pathways or caves like the one we find the shrine in the Leviathan skeleton in. One of my biggest hopes is that we see Breath of the Wild's version of the Arbiter's grounds no longer buried beneath the sand. Whether it is 1, excavated by the Gerudo, thanks to them finally being able to freely travel around the desert, 2, uncovered by an earthquake or another event, or 3, it becomes one of the various areas that are raised into the sky. The same could be said for Death Mountain, allowing access to new areas, caves, or even a potential fire dungeon. Similar situations could happen for other areas to reveal another cave, dungeon, or temple entrances. One dungeon I don't believe would require any change to the landscape to find is a water dungeon. It seems to always be in a similar location, at the bottom of one of the islands found in the middle of Lake Hylia, like an Ocarina of Time, or in an underwater crevice similar to Twilight Princess. All we would need is for Link to get an item such as the Water Dragon Scale, like from Skyward Sword, or an updated Zora Tunic to reach this area. It's also a possibility that we would see some parts of Hyrule look worse than in the original. A lot of the fissures or openings in the ground that have been mentioned could end up looking similar to areas such as Tanagar Canyon, which leads to the Forgotten Temple or the Breach of Demise, which Nintendo had intended to look darker or ominous compared to other areas. Noticeably absent from the trailers are the Shika Towers and the Shika Slate. This means we may have a new way to warp or fast travel between locations. Instead of the Shika Towers, we could be using the so-called Zonai Towers. The original designs and the notes given by the developers may suggest it's possible they could take the place of the Shika Towers. The original concept art looks similar to them, however, had a dragon wrapping around the center pillar with its mouth opening to hold the top platform in place, which, interestingly enough, does draw some connections between how this looks and the small spiral portals the real dragons fly through. This may be their way of traveling or warping to another realm or passing through the cloud barrier. The original Japanese description of the Zonai Towers state, stone pillars of obscure purpose, together referred to as the Zonai Towers, thought to have been used for spells. It continues talking about them being a savage tribe, mysteriously and living in FRAN, before once again mentioning their magic. With possessing the power of spells, it's rumored that this group disappeared suddenly thousands of years ago. So what if by using their magic and spells, they were able to travel to the Sky Islands or to whatever other world or realm the dragons are traveling to through their portals? After all, one of the only things we know is 100% certain is how strongly they worshipped and built their entire culture around these dragons and other entities representing the Triforce, such as owls for wisdom and boars for power. Masterworks says, possessing the power of spells, it's rumored that these people disappeared suddenly thousands of years ago. It's possible the place they disappeared to could be the place the dragons live or are traveling to, which could also be the location of these Sky Islands. We know Link himself will be getting new magic abilities as well, even having control over time manipulation and warping or phasing through solid objects. Maybe one of the spells or abilities he receives will allow him to use these towers to warp from one location to the other, possibly to locations in the Sky Islands or to wherever the Zonai disappeared to. It's also a possibility the small circular drip portals we see on the ground towards the end of the second trailer could serve the purpose of teleportation in the game, either on the ground alone or from the ground into the sky.
We have a few new Patreon supporters that I would like to give a thank you to. If you would like your own shout out, then head over to patreon.com/GameOverJesse, where you can receive a ton of different rewards while helping us out. Those of you who are just donating a single $1, that really does help more than you would think. Thank you Monica Spath, NORNARB, Shadow to Us, SoberRx, Andremoy, Natsu, Rusty Caulfield, Zoe M, Candy, David Guthman, Ashton Wren, BKRS7, Blargnar, Chad Costin, Gus Calvo, Henry, Jesse Birch, Jesse Wood, Jon Snow, Larulian Sheep, Lovable Christie, Mr. Monocled Metroid, Super NX64, and ZAIN.